Jesus Christ is the only way, and what you can say to people who object to that truth. Number two, God sends good people to hell. Not only do religions like Mormonism, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, not only do they lead people away from the true God, they lead people to an eternity of separation from God in hell. You know, Jesus was very clear. Hell is not only going to be populated by murderers and drug dealers and child abusers. Hell is going to be filled with good, religious people who have rejected the truth of Christ. And we're going to talk about hell and what the Bible says about it. Thirdly, and here's one that even Christians have a hard time swallowing. It's the outrageous truth that God is ultimately responsible for all suffering. One of the most common questions unbelievers ask us is, if there is a loving God, why does He allow famines and earthquakes and hurricanes and starving babies? Why does He allow all of these things to happen? Haven't you been asked that before? And a lot of Christians, in an attempt to let God off the hook, they end up castrating the Almighty. They say things like, well, you know, God wishes those things wouldn't happen, but He's just powerless to stop them. Do you believe that about God? Let me be very clear. I do not believe God's the author of evil. But if God has the power to stop these things and He doesn't stop them, then He's ultimately responsible. And the good news is God takes responsibility for everything that happens in the world at large and in your world in particular. There is a great comforting truth about the sovereignty of God that ought to allow us to say God has a purpose. He has a purpose in everything that happens. Number 4, homosexuality is a perversion. We're going to spend 2 weeks talking about that truth, that homosexuality is a perversion. It is a twisting of God's plan for human sexuality. By the way, we don't use that truth to discriminate against or to mistreat or to bash homosexuals. What we are saying is God has a plan for sexuality, and here's the plan: one man with one woman for life. That is God's plan. That's what God did for us. By the way, non-Christians have it right in one way. They're right in pointing out the hypocrisy of Christians who speak out against homosexuality as a perversion, a twisting of God's plan. But these same questions, when it comes to adultery, when it comes to premarital sex, when it comes to unbiblical divorces and remarriages, they stay silent. All of those things, too, are a perversion, a twisting of God's plan for human sexuality. In this message, we're going to expose and explode 7 common myths about homosexuality. Number 5, husbands are to be the leaders of their families. Is the idea of a wife submitting to her husband, is that something to be relegated to the Stone Age, or does that truth apply today? We're going to talk about what the Bible says and what it doesn't say about submission. Number 6, evolution is a myth. Regardless of what you hear in the classroom, there is absolutely no credible scientific evidence for macroevolution. And in this message, we're going to talk about the 4 fatal flaws of evolution. And I'm going to provide you in just 2 messages with the very best scientific as well as biblical evidence against evolution. By the way, people who say, well, I'm a theistic evolutionist. That is, I believe God used evolution to bring life into an existence. A person who says that doesn't know very much about the Bible, and he sure knows nothing about science. Evolution, by its definition, has no allowance for an intelligent designer. You have to believe one or the other. We're going to talk about why we can say with confidence evolution is a myth. And number 7, America was founded as a Christian nation. If you've spent any time in the public school classroom, you probably heard since the time you were a child that, number 1, America was founded not by Christians but by secularists and deists. Number 2, those who came to our country looking for religious freedom came from a variety of religious backgrounds. And number 3, the foundational principle on which they built this nation was the separation of church and state. All 3 of those statements are lies. We're going to look at the truth of history about the founding of our nation as a Christian nation. Ladies and gentlemen, these are truths that are regularly denounced in the classroom. They are denounced on television. They are denounced in most churches today. But I believe it's time for Christians to stand up and say, this is what we believe. Here's why we believe it. By the way, this entire series is built on the notion of absolute truth. That is, there are some truths that are true regardless of a person's religion or culture. It's what Francis Schaeffer referred to as true truth. Let me just share with you briefly 3 foundational principles about absolute truth that are really going to be the undergirding of this series. Number 1, absolute truth is universal. Write that down. Absolute truth is universal. I was listening to a talk show host here in Dallas on the radio driving to work, and the subject of discussion was whether or not the 10 Commandments should be displayed in the public classroom. And the caller called in and he said to the host, well, I'm a Christian, and of course I believe the 10 Commandments ought to be displayed, but I believe they ought to be displayed because these 10 rules for living apply to everyone, Christians and non-Christians alike. So everybody should see them. And the talk show host, who happens to be a Christian, said, well, I agree with you. I'm a Christian, but not everyone believes like we do. And the caller said, well, that's the point. Even though everybody doesn't believe in these truths apply to everyone. And the host said, well, you and I believe that they apply to everyone, but just because we believe it doesn't mean it believes that it applies to everyone. And on and on and on and on and on they went. They were in an argumentative circle there. You see, that talk show host had bought into this concept of relativism. It's the idea that absolute truth only applies to people who believe that it's absolute truth. Truth only applies to those who believe it. Can you think of anything more ridiculous? Think about it. Truth only applies to those who believe it's the truth. If you get up on top of this sanctuary and say, I don't believe in the law of gravity, and jump off this sanctuary, what do you think is going to happen to you? Because you don't believe in the law of gravity, you're going to float suspended in the air? It doesn't matter whether you believe in the law of gravity or not. If you jump off this sanctuary, you're going splat on the sidewalk below. You see, there's some absolute truths that apply to us whether we believe in them or not. And that's certainly true with God's truth. It doesn't matter whether you believe it's God's truth or not. These things apply to you. William Watkins, in his book, The New Absolutes, rightly points out that everybody believes in absolute truth, whether they say it or not. For example, the person who says there is no such thing as absolute truth has just made an absolute statement. That person has said nowhere in any corner of the universe is there any truth that applies to everyone. No, what really has happened is we have simply replaced old absolute truths for new truths. That's what we're doing. That's what our culture is doing. Let me illustrate that for you. For a long time, it was the old truth that life begins at conception. People believed that. But today, many people have replaced that old truth with a new truth that says a woman is free to do whatever she wants with her own body, even if it means murdering an unborn child. That is an absolute truth. That is an absolute right that she has. And people believe that today. They've exchanged one truth for another one. It used to be that people accepted the truth that it was in society's best interest for government to promote the spread of Christianity. And for the first 160 years of our nation's history, government was adamantly involved in propagating the Christian faith in our nation. But that old truth has been replaced by a new absolute truth. And that new absolute truth is any discussion of religion should be banned from the public square. It used to be, an old truth that was accepted was, there are some forms of behavior, some types of sexual activity that are immoral. But that absolute truth has been replaced by a new truth that says we should not judge anybody's sexuality, that everything is permissible. Again, in our culture today, the greatest vice, the greatest sin is to claim to be true, to be right about anything. Or as one public school administrator said with a straight face, it is the mission of public schools not to tolerate intolerance. My point is simply this. Everybody believes in absolute